In this video, we'll be creating complete full stack authentication and authorization system for Next.js applications. We'll be using NextAuth version 5, which is also called as Auth.js. We'll take a look at two kinds of authentication methods. First, credentials auth, which basically involves email and password or username and password. And then we'll take a look at social auth, like login with Google, login with GitHub, things like that. We'll be using some other libraries also, such as Zod for form data validation and Shadcn for UI related components. Now, before we get started, there are two important things you need to know so that you can understand how this all fits in a bigger picture. Whenever you create a full stack application, typically the flow starts with user registration and then authentication and authorization part comes. In this video, I will explain the authentication and authorization part. If you want a video on user registrations, just put a comment, I will create one. Second thing is, NextAuth supports two kinds of session strategy, JWT and database. This video is about JWT session strategy. Alright, let's get started. If you have never worked with authentication systems before, there are two important concepts you need to understand. Authentication and authorization. Authentication is this process of verifying the identity of the user. For example, if a user claims they are user X, are they really user X or not? Authorization, on the other hand, is about determining what that authenticated person is allowed to do. For example, you could have two kinds of users in your application, admin and normal users. And based on their roles, you want them to be able to see different pages in your application, right? Okay, so now we have this basic understanding about authentication and authorization. Let's now start writing some code. We'll quickly scaffold a fresh Next.js 14 project. I will choose all of the default options. Let's change the directory to that project folder. Now the first step is to install our dependencies. There are only three things we need: NextAuth, Zod, and Shadcn. Since NextAuth version 5 is still in beta right now, we will have to install the beta version. And since I'm using pnpm as a package manager, I will use this command pnpm add and then the name of the package. In this case, it is going to be NextAuth beta. And at the same time, I will also pass Zod. If you are using npm, the command would be npm install NextAuth beta and Zod. Then for the Shadcn setup, you can run npx if you're using npm, or in my case, I'm using pnpm, so I'll do pnpm dlx and then Shadcn UI latest, and we will initialize Shadcn. I will choose all of the default options. Now all of the dependencies has been installed. Let's open this folder in the code editor. We'll replace the content of this home page with some simple HTML. And if I try to access the page right now, we'll get this error, module not found. And the reason for that is because we are using some of the Shadcn components that we have not installed yet, specifically the card component. So let's install this. In order to install any Shadcn component, you can simply use this command npx Shadcn UI latest add and then specify the name of the component that you need to install, in this case card. I'm using pnpm, so I will use pnpm dlx to install the card component. Alright, let's see what I'm actually doing in this page. I've basically imported this card component from Shadcn components. Then I'm just rendering this card component over here and nothing else is going on. Then inside of this card, we are rendering this image and then some of the text that is present here. If you notice carefully that we are trying to load an image from images.pixels.com, that means we also need to tell Next.js to allow loading images from this domain. So in the next configuration file, I can come here and in this I can add an images property, which is going to contain a domains array. And in this one, I can simply specify images.pixels.com. And now you can see our page is loading. Let's now set up NextAuth step by step. Step 1 is to generate an auth secret. And the recommended way you generate an auth secret in NextAuth is by running this command called npx auth secret. If you are using npm, I will do pnpm dlx auth secret. What this will do is it will create an auth secret and add it to your .env.local file. if that file does not exist, it is going to create that file and then add the secret to that file. That means after running this command, we should have a .env.local file, as you can see, that contains the auth secret. Step 2 is to create a NextAuth configuration file. So at the root of the project, I will simply create a file called Auth.js. Inside of this file, I'm going to import NextAuth from NextAuth. And in this file, I'm going to call NextAuth by passing a configuration object. This configuration object is going to contain a provider's property, which is going to be an array. And let's keep this empty for now. We'll fill this later. When we're calling this NextAuth, we get a bunch of useful things that we need to export out of this file. So let's export all of those things. We need to export handlers, sign in, sign out, and auth. All right. Step 3 is to set up a route handler at this exact location. So inside of this app directory, I will create a folder called API. Within this folder, we are going to have another folder called auth. Within this auth folder, I'm going to create a catch-all route. I'm going to call this NextAuth. And then we need to create a route.ts file inside of this NextAuth folder. In this file, we need to import handlers from our auth configuration file. And then we need to export get and post method out of this file. Step 4 is to create a middleware file at the root. So I will create a middleware.ts file at the root of the project. So this is going to import auth from the auth configuration file, and we will be exporting this auth as middleware. Now the reason why this is important is that you do not want your users to be logged out while they are using your application. So what this will do, every time this middleware is called, this will keep on extending the session expiry. Right now this will be called for each request, and we do not want to do that. We want to execute this middleware only for some specific request. So for that, we can basically export a config object from this file that includes a matcher array. This matcher array basically accepts a list of URLs for which your middleware will be executed. So with this regular expression, I'm just specifying that execute this middleware for all of the requests except API request, static file request, and images. That's it. Now the final step is to set up our providers in the auth configuration file. We will start with credentials provider. So first thing that we need to do is we need to import credentials from NextAuth providers credentials. Then we need to call credentials by passing a configuration object. Now this configuration object mainly has two important things. First is this credentials property, which I will talk about in a bit. And second thing is this authorize method, which basically gives you access to the credentials that user has passed when they were trying to log into your application. Now here's the important thing. The only way a login becomes successful when we return a user object from this authorize callback. For all other scenarios, we can simply return null to basically indicate that something is wrong. So a typical flow for authorize method would be something like this. We create a user variable and set it to null. We get the credentials and we validate these credentials over here. And then you could imagine that we get the user depending upon if the user exists in your database or not, and if the user exists, is the password correct or not. So depending upon all these conditions, you could get a user object from the database. And if the user does not exist, we are going to return null. Otherwise, we are going to return the user object. So right now I'm just hard coding this user object, not fetching this from the database. And you could imagine that based on these credentials, you validate these credentials, you get the user from the database, and then you can return this user object from this authorize callback. Now at this point, we can test our authentication system. NextAuth automatically gives you some of the pre-configured pages such as sign in. And what this means is that we can go to a route API auth sign in. And you'll notice a little form over here. It just has a button in it, sign in with credentials. Now this may seem a bit weird, but even at this point, we can see if our login system is working or not, as we are not actually validating the credentials and just sending back an hard-coded user object, as you can see over here. Let me show you. I will open the application tab in the developer console. I will go to cookies tab, And notice what happens when I click on this sign in with credentials button. When I click on this, you'll notice that I basically get redirected to the home page. But that is not the important thing. The important thing is that we are getting this session cookie, and this session cookie gets created, which basically represents that we are logged in. So let me just clear all of these cookies and see what happens when we return null from the authorize method. I will clear all of these cookies. I will come here and I will simply comment out this user object. So you could imagine that you did not find any user, or probably the password is not correct. So in that case, we are going to return null from this authorize method, right? So in this case, what is going to happen is if I just go to this page and I click on this button, you'll notice that we are not generating that session cookie, and we are seeing this message sign in failed, check the details you provided are correct. We can use this credentials property to specify which fields do we need in our form. So with this, I'm just specifying that I need an email field and a password field. The label for email should be this, the label for the password should be this, and the placeholder should be this, and the placeholder for password should be this. If I just come to the page again and refresh the page, you'll notice that we are seeing those fields over here. Okay, so at this point, our authentication system is working. How about we show some different UI based on if the user is logged in or not? First of all, I will uncomment this user object, and then I will come here and I will simply click on the sign in with credentials so that it basically generates a session cookie for me. So right now I am logged in. Inside of this components folder, I'm going to create a navbar component. And this navbar component, as you can see, is just a nav HTML element that has some links in it. And we are also using this button component from Shadcn. We also need to install this button component. So I will quickly install the button component. Now I will include this navbar in the layout file. So I can come here, above the children probably, I can include that navbar. Perfect. Now it should be part of the layout. Okay. So as you can see, we are basically rendering a few things in this navigation bar. First of all, on the left side, we have this Auth.js, and then we are rendering these two buttons, sign in and sign out. But these two buttons does not really make sense. What should happen is, if I am already logged in, I should only be seeing this sign out button. Otherwise, I should see this sign in button. We can basically get the session data if we are logged in, and then based on that session data, we can conditionally show these buttons over here. But here's the important thing. Depending upon where you are trying to access this session data, either on the server side or client side, the process is a bit different. So let's understand these one by one. The first thing that I will do is I will go to navbar component and I will convert this to a client component. And when this is a client component, we need to remove a sync from here. Now nothing changes as of now. You can see everything is working as expected, right? So if you want to access the session data in case of client components, what you need to do is you need to wrap your entire HTML with a session provider. So I will go to the layout file, and then I'm going to import the session provider from NextAuth React. Then we need to wrap our entire HTML with the session provider like this. And now we can access the session information inside of any client component. So let's go to this navbar. I will import use session from NextAuth React, and then we need to call the use session. This will get us the data. I will rename the data to session, and then I will log the session over here for now. So if I come over here, go to console and refresh the page, you'll notice that we are basically getting this object, and this contains two important things. First of all, this contains this expires property, which basically represents when your session is going to be expired. And then this also contains this user object. So that means we now have the session available. And then we can use this session info to basically render these buttons. I can basically say if the session does not exist, show them this sign in button, otherwise show them the sign out form. So if I come over here, you'll notice that we are getting the sign out button over here. And if I just come here and go to application tab, clear my cookies, refresh the page, you'll see that I'm getting this sign in button. So this is how you can access the session info in case of client component. Let's see how do you access the session info in case of server component on server side. I will get rid of this use client directive at the top of the file. I will remove all of this from here and also remove this import statement. Now we need to import auth from the auth configuration file, and we are going to make this an async function. And now I can simply get the session by just calling this auth. It is as simple as that. So if I just show you, you can see that this is still working as expected. So if I just go to API auth sign in, I click on this to basically sign in, you can see that we are now seeing this sign out button. Okay, so at this point we have basically understood a few things. How do you set up NextAuth? How do you set up credentials provider? How do you allow users to log in with the authorize method? How do you access session in client side and server side? And how do you use that session info to conditionally render different content on the page? But if you take a look at the current sign-in form, you'll notice that this does not provide a very good user experience. The good thing is that we can create our own custom sign-in form. And that is exactly what we are going to be doing now. Inside of this app directory, I will create an auth folder. Inside of this auth folder, I'm going to create another folder called sign-in. And inside of this sign-in folder, I will create a page.tsx file. And I will add some basic card UI in this sign-in page for now. First of all, this is going to be a client component. We are importing card component, and then we are just rendering this card over here. If I go to this page now, auth sign-in, you can see that we are basically seeing this. Now for the form, we are going to use a Shadcn form component. This uses a React hook form and Zod to provide a very robust user experience. You will understand what I'm talking about in a bit. So let's add the form component. I'm also adding this input component because we are going to be needing this. This will install the form component and all of its dependencies also. So let's set up the HTML structure first. So in this, what I'm doing now is that I have imported this form component and all of its subchildrens, which we need. And then inside of this card content, I am basically rendering this form over here. This form component basically accepts a form HTML element. And then inside of this form, you basically pass a form field. This form field has a lot of props such as a name, then this render prop, which basically returns a form item. This form item has this form label and form control. In the form control, we have the input. So for the input component, we have basically mentioned that the type is going to be email. This is the placeholder. I do not want autocomplete with this. And then we are basically spreading out all of the props that are passed in the field object. Now, similar to this form field, we can add another field for password. So this is pretty much exactly like the previous field. The name is password. The label is password. At this point, if I try to access the sign-in page, we'll get this error, cannot read properties of undefined. And the reason for that is because we are not done yet. So what we need to do is, at this point, we need to create a form instance. So for that, the first thing that we'll do is we are going to import use form from React hook form, and then Zod resolver from hook form resolver Zod. And then we are going to call this use form. This use form is going to return the form instance. At this point, the important thing to notice here is we are basically passing this object. In this, few important things are going on. So in the resolver, we are basically passing the Zod resolver. Ignore the sign-in schema for now. We'll take a look at this in a bit. But the second important thing is this default values. So I'm basically specifying the default values for email and password input fields, right? This resolver property basically represents which tool or library or things or functions you are going to use for your data validation. So with this, we are just specifying that I'm going to be using Zod for form data validation. And for the TypeScript, we can basically infer the type of sign-in schema, which does not exist at this point. And if you're using Z, then we also need to import Z from Zod, import Z from Zod. In this sign-in schema, we are going to set up the structure for our form data and also set validation rules for them. So inside of this lib folder, I can create a file called Zod.ts. And then I can import object and string from Zod. I can export this constant called sign-in schema. This is going to be an object. And in this, what I'm just specifying that email is going to be of type string. This is going to be required. And with this, what I'm just saying is that email is going to be of type string. And if the email is required, show this error. If the email is less than 1 characters, show them this error. If it's an invalid email, show them invalid email. And similarly for the password, if the password is required, show them this error. And for all of these conditions, show these error messages. Right? So this is how we set up the structure of the form data. And this is how we set up the validation rules for each of these fields. And then we can import the sign-in schema in the sign-in page. Okay, now in the form component, so now we have this instance of the form. We need to basically spread out all of the things that are present inside of this form and pass that in the form component like this. And for all of the form field components, we need to add a control prop and set its value equal to form.control. I will do this in the email and I will do this in the password field also. All right, now we just need to add a submit button to this form. And since the submit button is also going to have a loading state, I will create my own component for that. So inside of this components folder, I will create a button called loading button. And this loading button component is going to accept this pending state. This is going to be a Boolean value, of course. So if this is pending, we are going to show them this loader. Otherwise, we are going to show this sign-in text. We can obviously pass some of the text from here and then render that text over here to make it more modular. But for this video, I will keep this as it is. Then in the sign-in page, I can basically import that component and use it over here. And for the pending prop, we are going to pass form.formState.it's submitting. So when the form is being submitted, this will be true. In that case, we will see that loading button. But for all of the other scenario, we'll see that sign-in text. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up a onSubmit form handler. So in this form element, I'm going to basically set up a onSubmit handler. So whenever this form gets submitted, we need to get the form. We need to call the handle submit method by passing the onSubmit function, which we'll be creating in a bit. And now I can create this onSubmit form handler. So right now, if you notice carefully that this is an async function, we'll add the sign-in logic over here. This is a try catch block. If there's any error, we are basically simply logging this error, an unexpected error occurred, please try again, right? And the values that this expect is going to be of type that is coming from the sign-in schema. Now for the sign-in logic, we'll be using a server action. Server action, if you do not know, is a feature in Next.js that allows you to execute your code directly on the server without creating a bunch of API endpoints. So inside of this app directory, let's create a folder called actions. And then in this actions folder, I will create a file called auth actions. First thing that you need to do is you need to add a directive at the top of the file called youth server. This makes this entire file a server action file. That means we can basically export a bunch of methods from this file, and all of those methods will be executed on the server only. The first thing we need to do is we need to import sign in, and sign out from the auth configuration file that we have created. We are also going to import the auth error from NextAuth. Now then I'm going to export a function called handle credential sign in. This is basically going to give us the email and password email is going to be of string and password is also going to be of string, of type string. I will add a try catch block in the server action. In the try, I'm going to call this await sign in method. Now this accepts basically two arguments. The first is, what type of login are we talking about? What type of sign in are we talking about? So I'm basically talking about credentials. And the second, it basically accepts object. In this, we can basically pass the email, password, and we can say if the login is successful, redirect the user to the home page. But if there's an error, we check if the error is an instance of auth error, and we check the error type. If the error type is credential sign-in, we simply return this object that has this message property with invalid credentials. And the default is something went wrong. And this is really important. In the end, you have to throw this error. This is really important if you're working with server actions. Otherwise, this is not going to work reliably. Now we can use the server action inside of the sign-in page. I will import handle credential sign-in, and I will pass the values, and we are going to await the results for these. And also, if you notice carefully in the server action, we are basically returning this object in case of some of the errors that are happening in the server action side. So we also need a way to render these in the page. We can call this error probably the global error and create a state variable for holding these errors, right? And then we can render these errors in the page. So what I will do is I will create another component called error message. So this is just accepting this error message and then rendering this UI, right? Then in the sign-in page, probably above the form component, we can basically add this condition that if the error exists, we render this error message component by passing the error message to that component. Let's import this also. So this is all pretty much what we needed to do in the sign-in page. And at this point, our sign-in page basically looks something like this. But we are not done yet. There are a few things we need to modify in the auth configuration file. So I will go to Auth.js file that we have created in the beginning. And just to show you how would you validate the credentials using Zod in the authorize method, you can do something like this. I can create a variable called passed credentials, and I can import the sign-in schema, and I'm gonna simply use this method called safe parse, and we're going to pass credentials in this safe parse. And then we can add a condition that if this is not success, we simply return out of here. So even though in the sign-in page on the client side, we have basically added the validation, it is always a good idea that you add validation on the server side also, right? So this is how we are doing that. This is really important stuff. Now the next thing that we need to do is at this provider's level only, there is a property that exists called pages. That basically lets you define the custom pages within your application. So I can use this and I can tell NextAuth that my sign-in page basically exists at this location, auth sign-in. So let's test this out. I will come here. First of all, let's clear all these cookies. I will simply click on the sign-in button and you'll see that I am basically getting all of this error. That email is required, and if I just fill this, you'll notice that this gets updated real time, right? So if I add the password must be more than 8 characters, and as soon as we hit more than 8 characters, that error basically goes away, right? So now I can basically click on this sign in button. You saw that we saw the loader also. The session cookie gets created and we are redirected back to the home page. So it looks like everything is working as expected. However, the sign out functionality is not working at this point. So let's implement that also. I will go to the auth actions file, and then in this auth actions file, I will create another handle sign out server action, which is going to call the sign out method that we get from our auth configuration file. And since this uses await, so let's also make this async. And it is very important that the sign out that I'm calling over here, make sure we import it from the auth configuration file that we have created. Okay, so let's use this server action to basically properly log out the user. In the navbar component, if you notice carefully that this button is basically wrapped with a form element. The good thing is that in the action prop, you can directly pass the server action like this. And what this means in very simple terms is that whenever this form gets submitted, just run this function that we have created. Okay, let's test this out. I will come here, refresh the page, and you can see that the session cookie is present right now. If I click on this sign out button, you'll notice the session cookie has been destroyed and we are basically logged out. So now login is working, logout is working. However, there is still one problem. Let me show you. I will again basically log in. I will log in again, basically sign in. So as you can see that I am logged in right now. But the problem is that I am still able to go to this sign in page, which should not happen if you think about it. So in order to fix this, we can basically use the authorized callback. So at the same level as providers, I can basically add another property to this, which is called callbacks. And in this, I can specify some of the very useful callbacks. And one of the very useful callbacks is authorized callback, right? In this, I can basically get a request. And from this, I can get the next URL and also the auth. Now, the first thing that we need to do here is that we need to check if the user is logged in. And I am basically checking if the user is present inside of this auth object. That basically means that user is logged in. So this is basically checking if the session exists or not. And then the 2 exclamation mark in the front basically means that just return a Boolean value in any case. So no matter what happens, this is always going to return a Boolean value, either true or false, and that is what we need. And then we'll get the path name from next URL, and we'll check if the path name starts with auth sign in and the user is logged in. We simply redirect the user to the home page, right? And then for all those scenario, we are simply returning true or false depending upon if the user is logged in or logged out. Now the thing about this authorized callback is this is going to be executed for all those requests for which your middleware will be executed. So that means if I just come here and if I just go to auth sign in page, it will redirect me to the home page again. But if I am logged out and go to that page, auth sign in, I'll be able to access this page. Okay, let's now see how we can set up social authentication. I'll be using the example of login with GitHub in this video, as it would be very easy for you to understand. The core idea is pretty much same for any kind of oAuth option. So let's do this step by step. First, you need a GitHub account. If you do not have a GitHub account, you can basically create it. It's very useful and free to use. Then you need to go to settings, developer settings at the bottom, then oAuth apps, and then you need to create a new oAuth app. You can name this anything you want. That is not important. The most important thing over here is this authorization callback URL. And this is going to be something like this. Obviously, if you'll be pushing this in the production, you will use that domain over here. But since I'm basically using localhost for now, so that is why my host will be something like this. And then API auth callback, and then the name of the OAuth provider goes over here. So for my case, this is going to be GitHub. If you're using Google, then it is going to be Google, right? So I will do GitHub, and then I will simply register the application. And for the homepage URL, I can simply specify localhost 3000. Let's register the application. After generating the application, you will get the client ID. You can generate a new client secret by clicking on this button. Then in your .env.local file environment variables, you need to add these two things, GitHub ID and GitHub secret. Then we need to import GitHub credentials provider from NextAuth providers GitHub. And in the providers array, we just need to pass this. So I will simply pass this like this. And then inside of the sign-in form, we need a button. So I can simply add a button below this form in the sign-in page. On clicking this button sign in with GitHub, we need to basically call this handle GitHub sign-in server action. So let's create that. In the auth actions, I will simply create another function and export this out of this file called handle GitHub sign-in. In this, I am specifying that the provider this time that I want to use is GitHub. And then after successful login, I want you to redirect the user to the home page. And then we can basically import this. Let's test this out. So I will come here, refresh the page. And right now you can see that I am not logged in. But if I click on this sign in with GitHub, you'll see that a session cookie gets created. And the reason we did not see that screen in the middle, which basically asks user if they want to allow this application to access to your account, is because I have already used this process before. So GitHub at this point already knows that this application do have access to my account and they can access my email. And that is why they did not show me that consent screen. But as you can see, this is working as expected. Perfect. Okay, so we have basically finished the authentication part. Now let's move on to authorization and look at some of the common use cases that you would encounter if you are trying to build an authentication system or full stack application. I will log out and then sign in with credentials. If I go to navbar and log the session, you will notice a few things. That this session basically contains a user object which contains the information name Aditya Singh and email jojo@jojo.com. So this is coming from that object which we returned from authorize callback. So let me show you. If I just go to auth.ts file, you'll notice that we are basically returning a user object which contains this same information as we are seeing in the session over here. But if you notice carefully that in this user object, we are not seeing this ID that we are passing from here. We're only seeing this name and email. And the reason why NextAuth does that is because it tries to keep the information as less as possible. And you always have this option of extending the session if you want. So let's see how you can extend the session and add some more properties to the session object if you really want to. In case of JSON Web Token strategy, inside of this callback, we have two very important callbacks available, JWT and session callback. JWT callback is executed whenever the token is created or updated. And when the user logins, we also get access to this user object. This is the same object that gets written from this authorize method that we are returning over here. So what we are doing is we're just checking if the user just logged in by checking if the user object present or not. And then we are simply adding the ID to the token. And then we are returning the token from this JWT callback. But this will only add the ID to the token, not the session object. So for the session, we have this session callback present. This gives us this session and token. And in here, we can basically say that inside of this session.user.id, set its value equal to token.id. So basically get ID from token and add it to session user object. And then we are returning session from here. Now this session callback is going to be executed whenever we are trying to access session. Now if you notice carefully that we are getting this error which is basically a TypeScript related error. And this is basically complaining to us that ID does not exist either in the token and user. So we need to tell TypeScript that it does exist. And the way we are going to tell TypeScript is at the root of the project, I will create a folder called types. And inside of this types folder, I will create a file called next-auth.ts. This we are just going to import next-auth and next-auth JWT. We will declare these modules over here and we'll say that the interface user also contains this ID property, which is of type string. Session contains user object, and our JSON web token also has this ID property. So now if we come over here, you will see that now we are not getting any error related to that. If I just log into my account and see the session object, you'll see that user now contains this ID property also. So this is how you can extend the session object and add more information either to your token or the session object or to both. Now in case of credentials provider, we are returning this user object and we are able to access this user object in this JWT callback whenever the user first logs in, right? But what if the user does not use email and password, but they use social auth, like login with GitHub, and in that case, you still want to add some extra information in the session? How would you do something like that? So for that, what you can do in this GitHub provider, we need to call this by passing a configuration object like this. And this has this profile method available to us, which basically gives us access to the profile. And profile basically represents all of the information that the OAuth provider will give you about this particular user, right? So you can basically pick some of the information from that profile object if you want, or if you do not want, you can simply return an object by adding your own custom properties. In this case, like something like ID, some random ID goes here, something like. So if I just show you right now, we are logged in with credentials provider and the ID that we are getting is 1, because this is what we are returning from credentials provider, as you can see over here. And in case of GitHub, we are basically returning this ID. So let's see if we actually see this over here or not. I will log out. I will click on sign in with GitHub. I am logged in. As you can see that I'm getting this user object, which only contains ID property. Now the second use case could be role-based access control. So imagine this example. Let's say that in your application, you have two types of users, admin and normal users. So in this user object, let's say that the user that has been logged in is an admin, right? So we are basically returning this user object that now also contains this role property. And we need this property in the session. So we can do that. Again, we can simply get that token dot role and set it equal to user dot role as string. And here also we can do the same thing, session dot user dot role and set it equal to token dot role. And then in that NextAuth TypeScript file, we need to basically tell that user also has this role property, which is of type string, and JSON web token also has this role property, which is of type string. So now when the user is logging with their credentials, we are basically adding this role to their session object also. So if I just sign out and then log in with credentials, I should be able to see the role over here. And I can use this role to basically conditionally allow some users to view some special pages. For example, consider this. Inside of this app directory, let's create two pages. Let's call this page 1 and then let's call this page 2. Page 1. So the page 1 basically can be accessed by any user, but page 2 can only be accessed by admin user. So we have basically created this page 1 and page 2. If I open these pages right now, page 1, you'll see that I am able to access it. But if I go to page 2, I need to do this page.tsx, sorry about that. And then if I just go to page 2, you'll see that I am able to access both of these pages, right? Now let's say the role of the user is not admin but normal user. So I can come here and I can sign out. I can log in again. This time the role will be of normal user. And if I try to access both of the pages right now, you'll see that we are able to access both of these pages. That means even the normal user is able to access both of these pages. So let's restrict that. And one way we can basically restrict something like this is again in the authorized callback. So what I can do, I can basically get the role of the user with something like this. And let's also say that if for some reason this does not exist, we are going to set this to normal user, right? And then we can add this condition that if the user is trying to access this page too and their role is not admin, we simply redirect the user to the home page. So now if I just come here and try to access this page 1, I can access page 1, but if I try to access page 2, since I am a normal user, I won't be able to access that page. But if I am, let's say, admin user, I sign out, log back in, sign in. And now if I go to page 1, I am able to access it. But if I go to page 2, I am also able to access it because right now I am an admin. So this is how you can implement role-based access control in your application. Now the third very important use case that would be very useful to you is how to update the session data. And there are many ways to update the session data in NextAuth, but one of the ways is by using a client component. So let's see that. The first thing we need to do is inside of our JWT callback, we are going to get a few things over here. We need trigger and we need session. And then we add this condition that if trigger is update and session is present, we set the token equal to all the things that token has along with all the things that session has. And then in any client component, we can do something like this. So I can go to page 1, let's say, and let's convert this to a client component. Then we need to import use session from NextAuth React. And when we call use session, it gives us the session, but it also gives us this update method. Then we can add a button over here. When we click on this button, we check if the user object exists inside of session. If we have, then we simply update that user object by passing every property and then updating the name to something like that. So if I just log in, you'll see that right now the name is Aditya Singh. But if I change this to something else, I don't know, maybe something like this. And when I come here and click on this update session button, I refresh the page, you'll see that the session user, the name has been updated. So this is how you can update session on both server side and client side using this client component approach. All right, that's all for this video. If you find this video valuable in any way, do like and subscribe to my channel and feel free to comment down your thoughts. I'll catch you then